I think currently it's at 3 children. I don't know if they've officially gotten rid of it yet, but they will. They will. It's just, it doesn't make any, I don't know if, I think they're kind of recognizing maybe it never made sense. Also, that policy was made in this context where I showed you that quote from the US report written by Henry Kissinger that said, you know, we've got to keep the population down. And in a poor country, it might seem more that way. But as you develop, say, hey, every person, it's like that also like in the United States right now. Many people are seen as a cost, not as a resource. Say, oh, you know, we don't have any useful job for you. You're worth less than nothing. You're a worthless person. You know, maybe you have a disease, you should just die. Maybe you're not very productive. Well, I don't know, maybe we'll just put you in prison forever or something like this. In a growing economy, every person's value, people are sought after. There's things to do that you can do that are productive. You know, if all you do is make a hamburger, you know. Oh, well, first here. Oh, okay. She's using the mic. Okay, I have to change.
Hello.
Hello.
My name is Jacob Munk. I'm a fan of the Schiller Institute. I'm not a member, but I've seen a lot of your videos, and I have actually many questions, but I'll only give a few here. First, I'm a Catholic, and I think that the philosophy of the Schiller Institute is quite close to Catholic thinking. Also, Helga LaRouche, I read a few of her books, and they are remarkably close to Catholic teaching about several things, history and so on and so forth. So just for my own curiosity, is there some kind of connection? Is Helga LaRouche a Catholic or what? It's not to, it's only curiosity, because it's very, very close, I have to say that. Well, question number 2. Every time I hear Schiller Institute videos or Lyndon LaRouche, there is always a prediction. There will come a huge crisis in next year or next year. Well, I'm 69 years old, and I've heard this prediction of these crises since I first met the Schiller Institute many years ago. Actually, I don't think I've ever seen one single crisis. So you say he's right all the time with all these predictions, but then I want to ask you, what is the definition of a crisis? I don't think I've ever in my whole life had the unlock of being in a crisis, living here in Denmark. Third and last question.
Okay.
China and Russia. I love both of these countries, most China, I have to admit. But they have a huge surplus of male, I believe, in China. And in Russia, they have a huge surplus of female. Why can't these two countries make some kind of I would say dating agreement, huge dating agreement to export maybe 25 million Russian ladies to China or 25 million Russian male to Russia? Because in Russia, it's a huge problem. They have such a big space and so few people. It's one of their main problems, according to Putin. It should be possible to solve it. I don't know if you have a take on that question.
Okay, those are very interesting. Let's work backwards. So on the, you know, there are a lot of talks about China, Russia, cultural exchange, and people-to-people connections. Maybe this is one of those types of people-to-people connections. So I guess it helps if the Russians speak Chinese and the Chinese speak Russian, so they can get together and meet. I don't know. I kind of am trying to picture now some sort of large festival or fair held for dating between China and Russia. I don't know. You know, hey, maybe. I don't know. I've definitely not heard about them planning it, but that's an interesting idea. And the reason that occurs. Internet dating?
Well, it can't be internet dating. That
No?
doesn't really get it.
Well, it works for some people, but, well, I mean, internet dating is to then actually meet in person and get married, you know. But what was I going to say about that also? About well, part of the reason for the surplus of males in China was, you know, under the one-child policy was killing the girls or aborting them. Because if you only had one child and you want to have a boy, if a girl is coming, you know. So I think ending the one-child policy will also help that terrible crime of, you know, killing for that reason. I have no idea. I don't know whether Helga is a Catholic or not. I just don't know. But it does, I think, make sense that there are, you know, the Catholic Church as an institution that's oriented in its best aspects towards the common good and improving humanity, making us more beautiful and better people. It would make sense to find correlations there and connections there. And I'm forgetting the names of these various popes, but, you know, the current one as well has intervened you know, on speculation compared to real economy. And that's been, maybe someone else can fill in a little bit more or speak to you afterwards about the other way that the church is related to economics and these other things. But I think it makes sense that, you know, because like some of these biggest concepts that people have, it's really hard to talk about them. The only way you can really talk about them is with a theological language. So I mean, theology, when you're discussing what is the relationship between the human individual and the universal, you know, as understood as God, as the creator, that's where the most profound thoughts about this exist. So I think it is natural to see a connection between theology, religious theology, and this outlook. As far as the crises, okay, let's take an example of that short video clip that I played. So Lynn said in 2007 that it'll be unstoppable, the system cannot be maintained. Some people would say that it was. In 2008, they'd say, sure, there was a collapse of the stock market, but then there was a correction. We had quantitative easing. We had money injected by the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank and the Bank of Japan, and things kind of muddled along. Well, I think that what happened at that time was the end of one financial system and the creation of a new one. I mean, between 2007 and then the world we've had since 2008, I think it really did create a world where it was just acknowledged very explicitly that the banks will get whatever they want. And the old idea of trying to be careful about giving out money this way ended completely. So, I mean, this one comes to mind. I'm trying to think of other things that maybe Lynn has said in the past. I'm not quite sure. I know that he was very happy that Hillary Clinton did not win the election and pointed out that this really reduced a lot of the pressure. You know, for the potential for a conflict with Russia that had existed. But that's a partial answer, I guess.
It's also tricky, you know, us being here in Denmark, because we are a very little country, located at a point where we don't really have big earthquakes, we don't have big natural catastrophes. We have been blessed with not really being in war. I mean, yes, we were occupied under World War II, but we haven't gone through any big disasters for quite a long time. So we accumulated a lot of wealth and a lot of investment in the country, which means that when these crises have come, where maybe in Indonesia, it suddenly meant that 100 million people lost everything they had and went from having a life to having no life for some time. And other places where you have great crises of starvation and this and that. In Denmark, it was basically a bump on the road, because we have so much wealth stored up that even after 2008, it really made a big dent into the economy, it did not mean going from having food to not having food. It meant going from, having planned 3 vacations that year to having 2.5 vacations that year. And it meant going from having maybe 4 years of getting social benefits if you're unemployed to only getting 2 years because of change of rules. So it's different scales. And therefore, sitting in Denmark, you say, what's the problem? Everything was fine, so what have you been talking about? But the point is, Denmark is not the world. It's not even a representative of the world. What goes on here, what is being said here, what is being discussed here, is not the world. And it looks a lot different. Say, what Jason went through in Africa, what was the impact of such a crisis in such countries? It's a totally different. It's for many people a difference between life and death. And our LaRouche's standpoint has never been. He has never been discussing the world based on what it looks like from Denmark. He is discussing not only partly how does the world look for all of humanity, but not only that. He's always discussed it. What does the world look like seen from the human civilization in the future?
Exactly, exactly. And that's one thing, like, it's similar to the point about, well, is it nice to build a well, or is it nice to give a goat? No, it's not, because there's so much more that could be done. That is, in context, it's a bad thing. The same thing with not being that bad compared to the past. You say, well, where has the growth been? Like, China's economic growth rate is phenomenal. What's it been in Europe for the past few decades? Let's say in Denmark. It's been, or at least for the past couple, very, very, very slow. So if you say, well, we could have had an increase of an order of magnitude, like if the economy could have increased by 10 times in the last 50 years. Let's go back to the space program. If that had continued, if fusion research had been funded at a very high level, and we had so much energy that we wouldn't even have to worry about it. You could heat the streets in the winter, keep them warm so you don't slip and break your hip or something like this. You create minerals easily, desalinate ocean water so that you don't have to worry about droughts. Compared to that, we're incredibly poor. Today, we are incredibly poor compared to where we should be. If that progress may be seen since the middle of the 1800s, if all the best parts of progress, if it had been like that the entire time, without the wars, without the conflicts, if that had continued, where would we be? We didn't just, oh, whoops, we felt, we're down here compared to that. So that's a very good point.
In Denmark, a lot of young people think that if we reach your that's a bad thing, because then we'll all just be more materialistic. We'll just be more superficial.
I know. Yeah. Well, see, the thing is, you can't, they get combined. Well, when you're rich, you get too materialistic. If you have nothing actually to do with your life, then you might try to replace meaning with material possessions. For a lot of people who don't have a lot of money, they get a little bit offended hearing about all these complaints about materialism. You say, well, gee, I can't afford a new car. I wish I was a little bit more materialistic. But you say, well, if you've got something to do with yourself, having a lot of money isn't a bad thing. Like, the phrase first world problems? Have you ever heard this phrase? How does that phrase get used? How does that phrase get used? For people who maybe haven't heard it.
Oh, yeah, tons. I saw one the other day. I have my friend, she got some gifts from ending high school, which was some trips in May, 2 trips in May. And then she also had 1 trip she made herself in May. So she had to go to Dubai here in May, and Malaga, and Paris. And she was talking about how exhausting it was, because it was. She said to me, "Oh, I know it sounds silly, but it's really hard because I can't get to stay at home and just be myself because I have to go."
Too much vacation.
That's
okay. So people say, well, that's a first world problem. They say that's a bad thing. Because they say, well, some people are very poor, so you shouldn't even mention that you have this kind of problem. Well, no matter how much money you have, you're going to have problems, More people should have problems like that. That's the thing. People say, well, many people are poor, so maybe I should feel a little bit guilty about having a better standard of life. Everybody should have a much better standard of life. Everybody should be able to go on good vacation. I mean, if the economy was increasing not by, a few percent over a decade, but by 30 or 40% over a decade, like it has in China, everyone's just doing so much better, and it's just palpable that you don't, Anyway, I just think that's an example of sort of looking at things of like, it's kind of going a little bit bad, and I'm doing good, but maybe I shouldn't be. In China, every year there's new high-speed rail lines. Every year there's a new place you can go on a high-speed train. Every year most people's income is going up. Every year people can afford more. I mean, it's just a phenomenal sense of progress. So it's also like where you're at versus where you're going. Like a Chinese person coming to the US or to Denmark will say, this is a rich country. High standard of living, very well developed. If they compare the trajectory, what's the rate of change, or the rate of change of the rate of change? China is by far ahead. Its growth is very rapid and growing. Compared to Denmark or the US, where the standard is higher, but it should be doing this. So compared to what it should be doing, I mean, it's going down compared to the potential. So I think it's always important to consider that. Don't compare the present to the past. Compare the present to what it would have been 20 years ago as the future. So 50 years ago, what did people think life would be like today?
They thought we would have commercial fusion power.
Sure, all sorts of things.
Mining on the moon.
Mining on the moon. People would have robots doing everything at home. People would
they
be...
actually talked about, these 3-day, 4-hour work week.
Yeah, right. Yeah, 20-hour work week, something like this. Sure. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I have a question, quite different question. Already today there is quite some big challenges about garbage, tackling garbage and pollution.
Mm-hmm.
And if we see the perspectives of what you have described, and with a growing economy all over the world, and more speed, and how will that be tackled? Some ideas of how to tackle that. Mm. Thank you.
Sure. Well, I think that in terms of one of the big potentials that fusion has, I'll come back to the garbage and pollution. I just want to talk about one other thing about materials, which is making metals. Like right now, we need to use some form of carbon to create metals. So if you're at a steel plant and you've got your ore and you want to turn it into iron, you have to use coke, we call it. It's coal that has been transformed like wood into charcoal. We turn coal into coke. So this is used, to basically chemically pull the oxygen out of the ore, so you just have iron or copper or whatever it is. It's a little bit old-fashioned. When we've got the kinds of temperatures that are possible with a plasma torch powered by fusion, you could just take apart the metals directly, take apart the ores directly. You wouldn't have to chemically use carbon to pull out the oxygen. I don't have anything against carbon, but it would just be a higher form of power in that way. So one of the aspects would be you could just simply, literally recycle everything into its elements, which would be great. You say, well, like some things we can currently reuse in a useful way. Some stuff you just say, well, there's no point in trying to reuse this, so just put it in the ground. There's plenty of room to put trash. I mean, so maybe it's not the most pressing issue, but it would be easy to be able to pull everything out if you could break everything apart this way. Sure. Yeah. People will say, hey, let's go back to the landfills and go and mine them. Say, hey, there's plenty of good metal in here. There's some, copper and some gold and little bits. Yeah. Yeah, sure.
But it's also, human creativity, For instance, in Denmark, we chose to basically have our energy from coal power plants. And then you get a lot of, rest products.
Yeah.
And you can say that's a problem. What are you going to do with all of these rest products? But it's only a problem until you have a certain volume. Because once you have a volume, you say, well, what could we use this for? And then it turns out that this is the best material you can have if you want to build highways. You need it to the foundation. You need it there. Or if you can use it to this, or you can use it to that. Or like here, we have a continuous project here in Copenhagen of expanding the city, which means taking places which were formerly water and then make land out of it.
Sure.
And it goes from being just water to become some of the most high-priced land you can imagine, because it's by the sea.
Because now you're on the sea. Yeah.
But the problem is, in order to do that, you have to put something there. And things like these leftovers are excellent for that. So it's only by this really concoction of saying, waste products. Waste products is waste products as it come out of a process, and it's going to be a resource going into another process.
Yeah.
And it's always been like that. So it's really a brainwashing, a manipulation all the time to speak about these waste products. That is a big problem. Because it's only through human creativity we can always turn something from a waste. Shit. You say, oh shit, we have all of this shit. What can you use shit for? You can use it for art. It's fertilizer. No, it's like, and that's the power of human image. We can do that. And it's only if you stop your brain and if you stop thinking and stop developing,
sure,
then you get a problem, because then it piles up.
Rather research and development.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it works and it's cleaner. I mean, I know the example of the U.S., best, of course, being an American, but the things are much cleaner than they were in the 1970s. But clean it up. You develop, here's a few examples. Like copper production used to create a lot of sulfur and sulfuric acid, and it was salt. It was a pollutant. And then they actually just started collecting it. Said, oh, this is bad. It's hurting the area around it. Collect it. And then they said, wait, a lot of businesses want to buy sulfuric acid. So they made money off of installing the equipment to keep the sulfur out. So that's good. Or petroleum, for example. Most petroleum is used for fuel, for combustion. But one of the biggest things is that we need petroleum for, okay, here, I got a plastic notebook here. What's plastic made out of? Oil, right? Also, you brought up coal. I think aspirin was first discovered as leftover products from coal combustion.
Really?
One other word is nuclear waste. It's called nuclear waste. Most of it's not waste. It's waste if you waste it. But basically, a nuclear fuel, it's just got maybe about 3 or 4% is the useful fuel. When it gets down to 2.5%, you just throw it away and put it in a box somewhere. If you just get it back up to the 3 or 4%, you can put it right back in a power plant. So also, that's the source of the isotopes that we use for nuclear medicine, for example. You wouldn't get them without the nuclear plants. So, recycling in that way, you take an output of one process and it becomes a resource for something else. Here's a big one. Our waste products, well, you brought up, crap, so, okay. There's another waste product we produce all the time. When we breathe out, right? We breathe out carbon dioxide. Plants don't see that they don't see that as a waste. They see that as a resource. And what do plants create? And what do the plants put into the atmosphere all the time that they don't want?
Oxygen.
Oxygen. Yeah, for them it's a waste. For us it's definitely a resource. So a lot of this, is sort of figuring out what are full processes that we can use. There's very little that can't be useful in some way. So. Again, we should be there. We're not. We're really poor.
Do you think then that this notion that in order to have technological advances, we have to get it from militarized actions, maybe wars, things like that, the GPS and so on. Do you think that's a necessity for the future, or let me put it another way, do you think that too many people follow that strain of thought, in which itself becomes a destructive thing and it's along the way?
Right. So there have been a lot of technological advances that came out of warfare. Part of it is that it becomes a high priority, And so since you say, well, we got to win this one, you end up putting a lot of research and development into it. And some of it gets useful somewhere else, but not necessarily. Like, consider the Soviet Union. They were developing these military technologies. They didn't do a very good job bringing them into their commercial economy, and they didn't do very well. But no, it doesn't have to come from that. It's also actually really inefficient. I mean, some things, it's like, you take the Manhattan Project, which was the US project to develop nuclear weapons. There was a concern that Hitler was working on this, and he said, well, we better figure it out first. If this is true, this would be a devastating weapon. So huge resources were put into this. Thousands of people, top people were employed, new cities were built. It was, a huge effort, and it did result in a lot of discoveries about nuclear science. Let's contrast that maybe with the space program. The space program is very connected to the military, of course, because if you can send a person into space, like, why were so many countries worried about Sputnik? So Sputnik's going up, going around the Earth. Why was that seen as a threat?
What's inside of it?
What's inside of it? Well, it just is a little thing. It was a little, But what else could have been put up there? It'd be a bomb, right? Or a weapon, a missile. So they're very connected, but the effort that was put in, when Kennedy said we're going to the moon, that was not really that was definitely not directly, hey, we need this for the military application. It really was, we're going to do this as a huge objective, as a mission for showing what the human species is. So I just think we need to move past it. We need to treat looking at how far behind we are from where we ought to be, and have a war to reach that, a war on our relative poverty. And just, it could be done. Like, another example that I'll bring up from my own country again would be Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. He said, we're going to put people to work. We're going to build dams and power plants and rail lines and parks and hospitals and schools and post offices. There was a huge effort to build up things and grow, and it worked. During World War II, U.S. manufacturing, it just went through the roof. The number of airplanes being produced every day, and that was under wartime conditions. But we should treat it like maybe it's good to think of it as treat it like a war. But right now, it's incredibly inefficient. A lot of money goes into military research, and it's actually not that effective. I mean, these latest fighter jets, what's the Joint Strike Fighter? Is that the name of it?
Yes.
Yeah, it was a big cost of, a huge amount of money, and it's really not any good. It's really, I think it's a radar. Well, anyway, without getting into any specifics, the return on the investments being put into military technology development, they're really not very good right now. Anyway, we shouldn't have to rely on that because war is going to have to be, it should already be a thing of the past. So it's kind of a silly place to look for needed advancements.
One more thing. Let's say a politician in the Horn of Africa starts a campaign on the basis of building a space program which will be ready in 10 years. Mm-hmm. What would the repercussions of that politician's claims be politically, do you think?
You mean like how would other countries or people in that country respond to that kind of a thing? Of being a space power within 10 years? I can tell you what it should be. It would be to say, great, that's wonderful. It would be happy to work with you for, this country would volunteer some expertise and that. I don't know how everybody would respond to it. So it's a little bit hard to say. But I think that, I'm trying to think of overall there has been encouragement. More countries in Africa are getting onto the space map, launching their own satellites. I think like Morocco, recently was, launched had its own satellite put up. So
it also brings up the question of appropriate technologies or the most modern technology. If you have a country, should they go through all the intermediate stages or should they be allowed to use the most advanced technology right away? Like if you look at the map that we had of Africa on our poster for this meeting, there were nuclear power state symbols everywhere. And this is a big provocation to say, okay, they should. Is it a concept called leapfrogging? That we should leapfrog to the most advanced, and that's what some of this African space program is involved with. That they want to be able to use the space program for satellites for looking for water, for agricultural, this scientific agriculture. This place needs this fertilizer right next to it. This place to have a very differentiated and advanced agriculture, weather prediction, all this stuff.
Surely the British Empire is against it, and unfortunately in Argentina, because the previous government would also have a satellite program, and then there was a change of government for a Wall Street British president Macri, and now the whole propaganda line is against this program of the previous government, and basically they're saying, oh yes, this previous government they were just ridiculous. They were sending refrigerators out to space. So that's some of the propaganda, at least, against.
And it's something like so 2017. Last year, the African Union meet every year. The African Union put forward an African space policy for the first time. Okay, here's our guideline of what we'd like to do. One of the big things on it, also in 2011, the International Astronautical Federation, which meets every year, every couple years, met in Africa for the first time, in South Africa. And South Africa is actually I think when it gets completed, it'll be the biggest, for large wavelengths, you need to set up multiple satellite dishes, over a large area. And the African Very Large Baseline Array, I think, will be the biggest in the world when it gets completed. So, yeah. In terms of the kinds of responses, it'll probably be as many different kinds of responses as there are political outlooks around the world. The best one would be, great, okay, let's work together. So glad to have you with us, and let's collaborate and figure something else out together.
But you can see the fight right now around Iran. First the issue was, well, Iran should not be allowed to have nuclear weapons, and Iran says, well, fine, we make a deal. We don't have any program to get nuclear weapons, and everybody agrees to that. They're not doing that. Everything is fine. It's being supervised. But then comes the next. But you should not be able to fire rockets. Well, you're not going to have a space program if you don't fire rockets. So the point will be used to say, well, if you have a space program, you can also, have rockets go up, dual-use technologies. And unless you accept being a slave on us and only do what we tell you, then you cannot have those advanced technologies. So it's a big fight. I mean, the same with nuclear power.
Yeah.
Who should be allowed to have nuclear power? Well, the International Association, what is it?
IAEA.
IAEA. The official doctrine is, of course, everybody should be allowed to have nuclear power. But in real life, there's been a big fight about who should be allowed to develop this technology and who should not. Because one thing is you can produce energy, but once you master these technologies, you're more powerful. And you're more powerful to do whatever you want to do. And some people says that knowledge should be, not everybody can have knowledge. Only those that have the right opinions or the right trends should have it. So I think that's another big fight, which is in it.
Or another example would be China. So you'd say, oh, China, space ideas, that's great, a wonderful thing. But what has the U.S. response been to China's space activity? Has it been excitement? And I mean, for many people, they're excited and positive. But the U.S. government says NASA is not allowed to work with China. And then export regulations restrict American space technology so these companies, U.S. companies, can't build components for China. So it's kind of a funny thing sometimes when these trade disputes occur. China says, we'd be happy to buy more American goods, but you won't sell us what we want. You're trying to sell us some of your, natural gas or oil or something like this. What we want is all your high technologies. So it's another example of where, a pretty bad response. But overall, that's the geopolitics. I mean, that's what we've got the opportunity and the obligation to reverse. And, what China's doing with the Belt and Road Initiative, I think, really opens up that potential to say, hey, look, new paradigm's getting started. We can improve that, build on that. We don't have to try to keep the rest of the world down to be number one. So.
I give you this, and when there's no more questions here, I have a whole series of questions about a different topic.
Oh, wow. Okay. A whole series.
Tell me, why are the Schiller Institute always against geopolitics? To me, it looks like there are different kind of geopolitics. Some geopolitics that benefits the world, and some other kind of geopolitics harming the world. I think what you're talking about here today, for example, it's geopolitics. It's good, positive geopolitics. So why demonize all kind of geopolitics? That's how I hear when I hear videos and speeches from this community here. It's always against geopolitics, as if it was invented by the British. But I think geopolitics is in every country. Even China has a geopolicy.
Well, I mean, historically, as an overall outlook and a term, it does have a British origin. But, well, maybe sometimes using a word, let's bring it alive. What does geopolitics mean to you? What do you think how do you see the meaning?
Policy for the whole world. Policy for changing the world.
Uh-huh.
For the worse or for the better.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm using it in a different way. I see it, and then as it was developed by Mackinder, and we had some actually very good. Did you see Harley's class on this? Harley Schlanger. We had a series of classes on geopolitics, and Harley gave a good history about it. The view there was actually using geography and the location of countries as a way of getting political ends. So, for example, creating a conflict somewhere to prevent two other countries from cooperating was using geography to achieve political ends. We're saying there's resources in this area, let's keep development from happening so that we can get those more easily. So it's not global politics. As a term, it really is a little bit more specific. And it was invented as like a field of study with that meaning of the term by the British. It really was. I mean, a lot of people say, well, China's being geopolitical. They say China's trying to take over the world. China's, people say that China's being imperial, that China is like the new imperial master in Africa. Now, how many governments has China overthrown in Africa? How many people's hands has China cut off in Africa? How many leaders has China killed in Africa? Right? I don't think any. So, when people say, well, this, I'm getting a little bit further afield, but when people say China is being colonial, I think it's an incredible disgrace to the true legacy, the real history of colonialism, which was nothing like, hey, I'll help you build this rail line, and maybe I'll push for a pretty good deal. I mean, maybe they're being a little bit tough on the business standpoint. That's not, that's not colonialism, okay? I don't know if that'd... But anyway, I can point you towards someone who knows more about this than I do, about the history of the phrase and its meaning there.
I mean, it's also the big problem we have, and which Helga said LaRouche has been addressing a lot, is that people in the West, and we know this, I mean, Copenhagen is like a hub of Chinese of sinology right now, because Denmark has a strategic partnership with China. We have a Confucian Institute here on the Copenhagen Business School. There's a lot of interaction, and a lot of Chinese scholars, both from China and from around the world, comes to Copenhagen and gives presentations and meetings. And whenever you have all of these Western Chinese experts and you have these discussions, then you get into the problem, because when we come there and we discuss the new Silk Road policy and Belt and Road and why don't we participate in this, they always say, but this is not just some good policy, this is China's attempt to take over the world. And they see everything China or anybody else does through glasses of geopolitics.
Through reflective glasses.
So I mean, in Denmark we have this saying, tyv tror hver man stjæler. A thief believes everybody else is a thief. And he cannot imagine the fact that somebody should be doing something without trying to steal. And that's the Western policy. And this outlook prevents us from doing what we should be doing, from recognizing that the Chinese policy is not geopolitics. It's not based on them getting a benefit and us having a disadvantage. They have a policy of saying we should all collaborate, we should all gain from it. Mm-hmm. But we can't get that because all of our institutions say, no, there must be some hidden agenda. If I were coming with a gift to somebody, I would never give anything to Africa unless there was some way I could trick them to steal their mining or something. So China must be doing the same thing. This is what Tillerson basically, he was projecting what is the long-standing US policy and saying, of course China is working this way. No, they're not. So we have a big, unless we can get people to see through this and realize that you could be acting in a different way, then we're not going to be acting in a different way, and then we're caught up in a wrong paradigm. And we have to somehow enlighten people to be able to see that there's a different way of looking on things and acting, which will be beneficial to us, yes, but also beneficial to everybody else. And that's the new paradigm. But people don't get it as long as they're caught up in this old thinking.
Yeah. And and every country probably has something to add. In other words, like China's Belt and Road Initiative isn't, as we all know, it's not like the final, perfect, absolute, ideal policy forever. I mean, but the question is, do you have something to add? Or are you just going to complain about this and say it's, being done for negative reasons?
It's funny. It sounds like what you just said. It's like the Danish saying, tyv tror hver mand stjæler.
He just said that.
Oh, I was in the toilet. I didn't hear that.
But it's true.
But it got me thinking of that. Okay.
Brilliant mind thinks alike.
That's right. That's right. Maybe let's do this list and then we can have some informal chat.
Yes. I really want to take advantage of you being here for some other types of questions. It's because I've been reading a lot of LaRouche's articles over again in preparation for your class, the complex domain and the one on natural law and a bunch of other ones in the last 2 months. And during your class, I have a series of questions having to do with the line arc of development of the idea of physical principles from Leibniz through Gauss to Riemann. And when you gave your class as a part of the last series, I asked you a question about the calculus and the infinitesimal to give a conceptual idea of that. And you were explaining about how the idea was how can you express constant change, and how can you express the relationship between, like you used the example of a graph of the acceleration of a car. How can you express the relationship between where the car is at one point and its intention, where it's going to be in the future, based on where it was before this tension between being and becoming. And so I would just like for you to, if you can explain more about what the Leibniz's calculus is, how it works, in a simple way, how it works. Because I never had calculus in school. And also the difference between the idea of the infinitesimal, the difference between the differential calculus and the integral calculus, and the importance of this as a physical principle for the scientific development after him.
Okay. Yeah, let's also, if anybody happens to have a nice chain on them, that would be great.
Chain?
A chain for a little catenary thing, if anybody's got one.
A necklace.
Yeah. Well, unless anyone has a heavy bike chain, maybe if I
What do you want it for?
if I could borrow it just to hold it up, it's shape, or
We're not strong
If I could.
bikers here.
okay. So okay, the calculus. That is a pretty big topic. So, yeah, sure. Show one quick demonstration here. See if this shows up. So it's difficult with the. Recently, I've liked to try to explain the calculus without time, keep them as two separate concepts. In other words, because time itself is a very tough concept. So let me say one thing about the catenary, and then we'll come back to time. So the maybe some people have seen this before. Does anybody know geometrically, especially if you've never seen it before, what shape this chain is making?
Put it on your stomach, it'll show up better.
Any ideas? Does it look like a line?
Hey, what?
Is it a straight line? Is it a circle?
How do you say oval in English?
Oval.
Oval? Just a half oval.
Oval. What is the shape of an oval?
What's what?
What is an oval?
How do you say, like an ellipse?
It's like a stretch.
Oh, ellipse. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, oval's a funny word. It means just looks like an egg. So there's a lot of ovals.
Oh, okay. I mean like an ellipse.
Yeah. Okay.
Like the.
Yeah, maybe it's part of an ellipse.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, there's a lot of ideas about it. Maybe it's a parabola. Now well, that bell's really going, isn't it? So how can we try to figure it out? I mean, how do we even answer that question? How should we approach it to learn the shape that this is taking?
Well, you could take a piece of paper and you could plot it in on these paper papers, and you can measure what are the ratios
Yeah.
in different places.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
then you can compare it from what things you already know, like the parabola or the ellipse.
Yes.
And then you can see, is it similar to any of these, or is it different?
Good. Yeah. Right. Plot it, nicely on a sheet of paper, and then try to fit a parabola to it. Try to fit a piece of an ellipse to it. So let's say we did that, and nothing fit, which is true. A parabola is pretty close, but if you look very carefully, it's not a parabola. If you make the measurements and count the positions. So that was one approach. Try shapes that we already know, and see if one of them will be the correct one. Any other ideas?
We could try to understand what physical shapes that thing in space.
Yeah, this isn't made by a geometry teacher. This is made by, it's really, something's making it happen. If I was out in the space station, would the shape be similar?
No.
What would it look like out in space? It could look like anything, right?
Yes.
It's floating around, right? So the only reason it takes this shape is because it's trying to fall down. If I let go of it, it would fall on the floor. So one of the simplest examples, and I'm not going to really go through how to get to it, I'll just say what the statement is that if you hold the bottom so that it's basically totally horizontal, which I hope I'm holding it this way now, the slope is proportional to the number of links in the catenary. If you go up 20 links of chain, it has a certain slope. If you count up 20 more links, double that slope. 20 more links, triple that slope. Just that with a whiteboard, we could. If you want to ask and follow up, we can actually go through it too. So what that is that doesn't tell you what shape it is. It tells you how the shape changes. From the physical thing, you get a sense of how the slope depends on the number of links. Does that tell you where to put the next piece of chain? Like let's say the chain was only this long. Does knowing the relationship between the slope and the number of links, does that let us say where it'll be up here? Where if I go 4 more centimeters to the right, how far up I should go? Does it tell us that directly? Yeah. So I know maybe not everybody's a math expert. It doesn't. It's not enough. And there's really no way to go anywhere with this problem without the calculus. So what Leibniz's calculus lets you do, and the way Bernoulli explains how he solved this problem, is to relate the slope, which is sort of the change of the chain. So like if the chain is only this long, and I want to add 1 more link, I have to do it at just the right angle, or it'll be all screwed up. Like if I tried to... Well, anyway, there's only one way to keep extending the chain. So the calculus lets us relate the way it changes to what the overall shape is. Before Leibniz developed the calculus, there was no way to do that. There were only shapes. The way a shape changes or develops was not in the language. For Kepler, this came up also. When Kepler figured out how the planets moved, he said that, well, the planets move quicker when they're close to the sun and slower when they're farther from the sun. That's the way that their speed changes. If he tried to put it into a specific formula of where will the planet be at a certain time, he ran into some troubles, partly because of the calculus and partly because of something else. But that's another example of a physical concept where we have a hypothesis about a change and we want to know what the shape is. The catenary. From some easy physics, we can get how it changes, but we don't know what the whole shape is without the calculus. In terms of the words differential and infinitesimal, it's really just integral. Oh, differential and integral. They're really just two. Infinite. Okay, so infinitesimal means so small that it's 0 if you compare it to things that have a length, but where it still has a intention. Like if you ask a kid how tall they are, they have a certain height, but they also have a rate that they're growing if they're growing up. So compared to like a specific height, the amount of growth you can't really measure as part of that. You have to see it over time, but it's still there in their height, is their growth that's going to come. So infinitesimals are basically, they always come in pairs. On the catenary, with the chain, catenary just means chain in Latin. That's all the word means.
In Danish, it's actually called a chain, a chain line.
Oh, okay, good. Yeah, good. You have your own word. That's good, instead of some Latin thing. So on that, for where I would add the next link to the chain, you can imagine that there's like a horizontal part and a vertical part to figure out what angle we should add the next link at. If you actually add the link, though, you'll now be at a new spot where the angle is different. So if you add a link, it changes. So you can only talk about what it would be if you added a link, but you haven't actually done it yet. How would you add the next link? If you actually add a link at that angle, it won't be right, because it's only really true if the link is like infinitely small. It's kind of a tough concept to try to do briefly, so I'm a little bit. Let me try the other parts of that, and let's come back. So that's the concept of an infinitesimal. It's not 0, but it's not something either. It's in between. It lives in between. Differentials are the way that something changes in general. So the catenary, we start with its differential. We know how its slope exists. We know how it will change as we continue to draw it. Integral means that we've gone from a change and worked out.
Can you say differential again?
A differential is the way that something changes.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe...
Rate of change. The rate of change.
Yeah, you could say that. Yeah, the way that something changes, its rate of change. And sometimes we get them from knowing a whole process, from you knowing a whole curve, and you can break it down into a piece and say how it's changing there. Sometimes, though, you start just with the change, and you don't know what the whole is. On the catenary, no one knows what the shape is until they start by saying, how does it change? How do I add one more link? So on the catenary, the differential is first. The differential is known first. An integral is just the opposite of a differential. If you know a difference, its integral is the whole thing of which the difference is the difference. Sometimes it's also called a primitive. So,
Could you give an example of a simple example
of a rate of change of a differential and an integral?
Yeah.
No, I mean I can give a simple example, but I don't know if it'll mean anything.
Okay.
So, are there any markers in here? I see there's a whiteboard in the back. We have whiteboard markers.
We could maybe get some.
Yeah, or maybe they're inside. Is it open?
Differentialregning og integralregning.
Huh?
You have to turn around.
Okay. I'm just trying to think of one that's going to be not just too dull. Okay, here's one. Let's do one with a circle. So if I have a piece of a circle, and I walk along at a certain distance, I can draw a line back to its center. And I went from a piece on, let's say, the diameter of the circle, and I walked up here. And I measured my distance. Often a Greek letter is used for this. So I'll use the Greek letter theta. That's how far we walked along the circle. Let's say the radius is 1 to have a unit. In terms of if we use the radius as a unit and we measure with a tape measure instead of a stiff ruler, if we have a piece of tape to measure with, we can, and the unit is radius is 1, we can measure along how many radiuses we've walked. This is called radians in math, in English. And that's why it's called radians. It's just the distance measured in the radius. So if we're at that place, we curved to get up there, or maybe we walked a little bit backwards and then up to get there. 2 different ways to arrive. This vertical height is called the sine of the angle. The name is just kind of crazy. It's a very silly name. Sinus? Sinus? What else is a sinus? What does the word mean? Are there any other meanings for this word?
Sinus
Goes like this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a mistranslation from Arabic. The word is really chord. In Arabic, the word was chord, like connecting 2 points on a circle like this, but it was mistranslated into sinus. So that's why it has this crazy name. It really is it's an old typo. So maybe what I'd like to ask is, if I rotate more, how much does the sine change? If I walk another step, how much higher up did I go? So we'd like to know that, depending on how far we've walked, what's the height of our next step? If, for example, we were way up here, our next step, we take another step, the change in height is very small. If we were starting at the very base and we walk a step, the change in height is very big. So the change in the height depends on where are we on the circle. So this is an example. We're going to find this out. This is a differential or a derivative. We're going to ask, how does the sign change? What is the height of the step depending on our angle? So let's go ahead and do that. I realized I picked kind of a bad angle, so I'm going to draw it again. Hopefully you can still see it. I'm going to start right here, a little bit lower. When I'm taking a step, it's a curved step. But I'm going to imagine that I took the tiniest step possible. I'm going to take an infinitesimal step. So it really is, I haven't made a step. I'm still at the initial point. But I want to imagine how I would take a step. On a curve, this is the tangent. Tangent, Latin for touching. This line touches the circle right at just that one point. So my step, I'm going to imagine it as being on this line instead of on the curved circle. Okay? Okay if I do that? So here's my new place. And I'd like to measure this height here. In Leibniz's language, he would say this is the differential of the sine of the angle. Would be that height. This height here actually is the sine of the angle. And we're going to, from this point, talk about how much we will change if we take a step. The size of the step, so the amount we had walked up so far was theta. The size of our step is d theta. That's how much we're going to change the distance we've walked. It's okay? So the magic of the infinitesimal is that instead of being curved, the step that I'm taking is just the hypotenuse, a straight line on this triangle. Let's see if we can figure out how tall this is. What's the best way to show this? I think, and I'll leave, maybe, well, if you want, we can go through it, but if maybe you'll take my word. I think that this little triangle here and this triangle here are similar triangles. I'll just draw two examples and see if you buy it, and if not, we can try and do a proof, but if we don't have to, I think it's better not to. So here's this one. So I think this triangle is similar to this one. I think up here, I think that this triangle is similar to this one. It's because the tangent's always at 90 degrees to the circle. So if we can say that, that's good. I'll introduce another word. This is called the cosine. The horizontal part of this triangle. Cosine, and this is the sine. The name cosine, anyone know where that comes from? It's the sine of the complement. If this is an angle, this is called its complement. And this is the sine of the complement. That was just for anyone who is interested. Don't worry about it. Okay. So if these are similar triangles, and the radius is 1, I'm going to pull the little triangle out over here. Its hypotenuse is d theta. This side, we want to know what it is. It's d sine theta, but I'd like to know how big is that. I think it's similar to this triangle. So not to scale, I'm going to draw it in the same orientation. This is the big triangle. Hypotenuse is 1. This is the sine. This is the cosine. 1 is to d theta, as cosine is to cosine times d theta. So I think that the difference of the sine is the cosine times the amount of the size of the step that you took. Again, I'll say it one more time. The size of the difference in the sine is proportional to what the cosine was at the point where you took your next step. We'll look at two example spots to see if it becomes intuitive. Over here, you're essentially walking straight up. Your very first step, if it was tiny, the circle hasn't started to curve, you're going to walk straight up. The size of the change in the sine is the cosine. Here the cosine is 1. The change in the sine, it's the full amount of the step that you took. It would be 1 times the size of the step. That would be the change in the sine. Right here at the very top of the circle, there's no change in the sine. When you take your step up here, you're not moving up or down. And indeed, the cosine right here, the cosine at 90 degrees is nothing. So I think the conclusion from this is that the differential of the sine is the cosine. Sometimes it gets written like this. Differentials come in pairs. So if we compare the differential of the sine compared to the size of our step, if when we take our step, we compare the upward motion of that step compared to the overall hypotenuse of that step, that ratio is the cosine of theta, based on where we are at theta. So in math class, they just tell you this is true. They never go through why it's true. It's just given to you. I've never seen anyone ever drawing any of these pictures. But so that's an example of a differential. Here we started with something that we know about. The circle's not a mystery to us. And from the idea of positions on the circle, we were able to say something about how, that sign that's going like this, we're able to say, okay, the sign changes based on the cosine. And if you aren't tortured enough, I just want to draw one more picture for that. So here, as we move along the circle, this is the sine. At the beginning, there is no vertical part. We get up to 90 degrees. And the vertical part's at a maximum. We come back to 180, we're back here. Nothing, there is no sine, there's no vertical. Down here, 270 degrees, it's negative. I'm going to draw in dots now what the cosine is. And then I'll be done with this. Yeah. The cosine tells you how the sine is changing. Here, the cosine's a nice big high thing, and the sine is growing rapidly. Here, the sine is done growing, and the cosine is nothing. So the cosine measures the change of the sine. This is an example of a differential. So long.
Thank you. You also
good,
see
or?
for many people how suddenly having mathematics very quickly can put them asleep.
I know, it's
No, it's different.
it is.
It's very different.
I know.
No, but the point of this is that the whole point that LaRouche takes up is that what science is not what you see and what you feel and what you touch. It's not just observing what is, but trying to figure out why it is And the whole point of this, as you said, was trying to figure out how you have an expression for change that is not constant. It's not change, just the same thing like the clock that goes tick, 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 tick. But you have changes that are changing. And that's an expression that you find in the natural world. And then you have to figure out what is the principle behind it.
Yeah.
And this is why one of the reasons why he's taking up these physical and mathematical questions of that science is the principles of why it is, and that the human beings can then use for improving our existence.
Like two things on it. One is think about economics that way. What's the differential, the change of your economy? I mean, if your economy is at a certain point, well, how is it changing? Do people think about that? You know, what's your maybe rate of percent GDP growth people think of, but what makes that happen, I think, is the important part. What's the rate of change? What changes the rate of growth of an economy? And is that a real thing? With the catenary, there's a real thing that tells how it grows as you continue it. It's it's a little physics thing. What's the real concept that corresponds or causes the rate of growth of an economy to increase? What kinds of real things make that happen? Another little calculus thing is if you know a whole shape, you can always go and figure out how it changes. But most problems are you've got an idea or a hypothesis about some cause of change, and you want to figure out what is the result of it. And that's really hard. There's no specific formula or specific technique that lets you do that. Sometimes it's actually impossible, and that means you need to expand your language. If you've got a cause and you want to be able to talk about its effects as resulting from that cause, sometimes there's no way to, there's no word. For the catenary, there's no like, well, anyway, yeah. But Riemann, Riemann wrote, he gave like a series of, he taught, and he gave lectures on the calculus, and he said there's, nothing has improved science as much as this. As the ability to have the concept that, hey, everything that you think about as existing has to be an integral of something. There's a cause of something, and then that brings about this result, and you got to think about everything that way.
But it's also a uniquely human thing to take a part of something, which we are confronted with all the time. I mean, we never see totalities. We only see something in part. And by seeing that part, being able to make a hypothesis about what is the whole. I mean, an animal will never do that. It's only human beings can do this, and this is a very profound thing to do, and this is something we do automatically. Sure, we have senses, but what we do is we have senses, we try to learn how to use them, and a lot of our first years is actually spent on simply controlling these senses to get some input. And then comes the part of you get some senses and learning what could this then mean? What could be the full picture that I can't really see, but I know from experience that this is what the full picture is like. And like when we hear somebody, when somebody says something, we hear maybe 60% of what they're saying. But it's not a problem because we can fill in the blanks. If we have a certain idea about what universe they're in, how they're talking, what they're trying to communicate. If some stranger comes up to you, the first thing is, do I understand this language? What language is it? And what is he talking or her talking about? But this ability to be able to create a whole out of a small bit, this is extremely powerful, and this is what this is. That you, so to speak, that you can. And this is what we do in everything, in all sciences. I mean, it's geology. You go out and you find some old rocks, and for most people it's just rocks. But if you learn how to read these rocks, it's a history book. It can tell you what happened to this place million years ago, 10 million years ago, 100 million years ago. Or you have Wilhelm von Humboldt, who knew, I don't know, 70 different languages. So he is able to go into a language and by looking at the language, see what part of this language is earlier and what part is later. And therefore, you can looking at the language tells what other civilizations had the people that created this language been in touch with. So it's a very human thing.
Yeah, like you said, animals get trained by observations or their senses. We think about causes.
Yes.
So. Yeah.
Are we ready for one more?
One more. Okay.
Okay.
You feel trapped?
No, the door's right here.
The idea of the tensor, and how
I'm feeling tenser. Huh?
and how that was an idea that was developed by Riemann, and how that is. One thing is just a simple idea of what it is. LaRouche uses it in a much broader way than the particular mathematical thing, but where that fits in this arc of development of scientific ideas. Why does Lynn have put an importance on it?
I think a tensor is like infrastructure, like in an economy. So a tensor is a word. It's a just to be very brief about it. So Riemann had posed some questions like, how do you know if something is flat? Let me just ask if there's any ideas. This table might be flat. How do we know that? How can we figure out whether this table is flat? What could we do? Put water on it, and then see what? Okay. Yeah, if the whole thing was tilted, it would roll off the side, or maybe it like all falls into a little lake. Okay. Okay. Using water, that's a good idea. Any other ideas?
Have a ball, steel ball, something very hard, very smooth, run on it, different ways.
Roll it and see what its path does? Like see if the path curves or something? Okay. So how do you know if the path is straight to compare whether it is curved?
You can have a string.
Okay, pull a string taut?
Pull a string very high, an elastic string could even be.
Okay.
Gets you at least an approximation of what it is.
Yeah, these are good answers. It's, if a mathematician tries to answer these things, it gets really tough. Like, how do you know whether a line is straight or not? Pulling a string taut, that's one example of it. Maybe sometimes people say maybe a beam of light moves in a straight line.
If they move in straight line.
If they move in a straight line. If a string is in a straight line. Huh?
There are no straight lines.
Yeah, well.
Give it a distance, double up.
Sure.
You will have a bow.
Yeah, well, even if I hold a string out like this.
You know the water here on the earth have the
curvature.
Yeah, do you know it's a ball when you walk around the whole earth? So
yeah.
The water will follow in that line. So when you have a string long enough, same will happen.
Right. If you pull the string, it'll eventually curve. Even if I pull a string taut right here, won't it sag a little bit in the middle? Maybe slightly, but even if I pull really hard, doesn't it come down a little bit? Well, is gravity pulling it the same way along its entire length?
Yes.
If it's a long
yes.
No.
Maybe not.
No.
I mean, if you, for example, held up a string and just had a weight hanging from it, and you walked all around the Earth, and you connected all those lines, they don't point to the center of the Earth. They point to different places depending on where you are. So this might seem silly, but I think even a piece of string that you pull real taut, it'll sag down. But down is in a different way depending on where you are on that string. So I think everybody would accept that it goes down like this, but it might even, I think it could even bend this way. I mean, it gets to a really tough thing. But of course, all of that presumed that we had some idea of straight in our minds that we're comparing these things to. So then Riemann said, okay, so line, straight, tough thing. Is a surface flat, tough thing? So then Riemann said, well, is space curved? So in other words, is the space that we're in itself flat, or is it curved? Which is kind of a difficult concept even to ask. And Riemann said, well, we don't have to believe that it's flat. It's not necessary. It might be that in space, just like on a sphere, for example, so there's a rule that the angles in a triangle are 180 degrees. It's not true on a globe. If I went from the equator to the North Pole and then back down, this big triangle, three angles, each is 90 degrees. So Riemann worked out, he said, look, we're not going to figure this out with math. You got to figure out what physically causes the relation of things in space. That's what space actually means. And then you got to figure out what those principles are. And then you could answer what's the shape of space. Tensors are a way of measuring the shapes of spaces of higher dimensions like that, like space or space-time with Einstein. So that's what it kind of means from that standpoint, but I'd say look at it as from infrastructure, for example, in an economy. Individual processes that occur in an economy occur in an economic space. What's the shape of that space? Let's say you have a factory and you don't change anything about the factory, but you've upgraded the whole rail network in the country. Well, it's now a lot cheaper to get things to that factory and quicker to ship them off somewhere. So maybe you'll actually change the kinds of parts that you use. Maybe you'll get them from farther away because you can actually get them better than from a close-by place, and it works better for what you're trying to do. So even though nothing changed in your factory, if the shape of the economic space does, what you do in the factory, its value changes. Other people could get your stuff more easily, that kind of thing. So I think that's kind of a rough idea of a tensor as a math physics concept and then in an economy.
Yeah, then there was a video that I should look at again. There was this video of the relationship between Earth and Mars, was it?
Maybe the orbit of Ceres?
Guided.
Yeah, the orbit of Ceres.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. I remember what you're thinking of. He did a transformation, I think, of viewpoint, and he showed. Yeah. I'm not really going to fully say this, but like Einstein would give an example about how like space-time lines would be different if you're watching a train go by on a station versus you're in a moving train. It's a similar concept. It's a very thin answer, but...
It was something about that in order to figure it out, if you went somewhere else, if you were standing on the Earth and looking at Mars, that you would have a hard time figuring out, but if you went out here and had a perspective both on Mars and the Earth, somehow you could figure it out better.
Well, what he did was he was measuring the, I think what you're thinking of is how he measured the Earth. So we're on the Earth, I hope, and we're going around the sun. And the sun's not at the center of the Earth's orbit. Or the sun, or the Earth moves non-uniformly. And this was known way back when. What's a simple thing that you might observe that lets you know that the Earth doesn't go directly around the sun? That it's not right in the middle. What about the seasons?
They exist.
The seasons exist because the Earth...
Even on the, what is it called, equator. Do they?
That's slight. Maybe that could be used, but it's not how it was first figured out.
I mean basically...
Yes?
The pyramids,
The pyramids?
the shadows.
yeah, so the question is, how do we know? Let me put it this way. If the sun was right in the center and we moved uniformly around the sun, the seasons are caused by the tilt of the Earth. So maybe here for the northern hemisphere we live in, here's summer, fall, winter, spring. They'd all be the same length. Each season would be the same length. But it's funny, some people say that we have summer because we're close to the sun during summer. It's obviously not true. Plus, you call somebody in the southern hemisphere, it's not summer, right? So because the seasons are not the same length, let's say the sun's over here. The tilt of the Earth determines where the season markers are. So this would be the solstice, and these are the equinoxes. So now maybe summer is short, and fall is much longer. So this is kind of the first clues about this. So if we're trying to figure out, okay, what's the shape of the Earth's orbit? We have some idea that it's not centered on the sun, but does it also speed up and slow down? It's really hard to tell because the distance here is very small. So unlike Mars, which everybody knew before Kepler, it looked like it was speeding up and slowing down during the year, people thought the Earth has a constant speed around the sun, or the sun has a constant speed around the Earth, but it's constant, and it moves in a circle. So what Kepler did, based just on observing where the sun is, against which stars it rises, it's very hard to figure much about it out. What Kepler did was he said, here's the sun, here's the Earth's orbit that we're trying to discover more about. And what he did was and here's Mars. If you take a look once every Mars year, so Mars is here, and then Mars comes back to the same place, and then Mars comes back to the same place. During that time, here's the Earth, and then here's the Earth, and then here's the Earth, and then here's the Earth. So Kepler says, okay, now we can use the sun and Mars to look at the Earth. The sun and Mars to look at the Earth. And then you can really figure out much more accurately what the Earth's orbit is. So Kepler used this to figure out that the Earth's speed does change. The Earth does speed up and slow down, which made it possible to have a universal astronomy. Because now all the planets speed up and slow down. Earth is no exception, which, Copernicus thought the Earth was not like the other ones, for example. I don't know, I'm not going to relate that to the tensor in particular, but just to follow up on what you're bringing up about seeing it from a different, I think this is the reference there. And the reason I said that you can see the Earth from the sun and Mars, you can't stand on the sun and Mars, but you can look at where you see the sun and where you see the Mars from the Earth. So you just reverse the directions of the observation. So. Okay. Maybe we should wrap things, or is there more?
I have more, but I don't know. Go ahead.
Well, let's change from science to theology.
Okay.
What is your idea about the concept of filioque? I read a book, I'm not quite sure who actually wrote it, but it was about this Nikolai de Cusa, theologist and bishop, being very much admired by Schiller Institute, I believe. And he says that the reason of the different cultural development in East and West, in Western Europe and in Eastern Europe, is because of the concept of filioque. Mm-hmm. Filioque is the idea that the Holy Ghost is coming from God and also from Christ.
Right.
And in Eastern Europe, they don't believe that. Mm-hmm. So maybe they don't really believe, because human beings are trying to be created to imitate Christ. That is the main purpose of any kind of Christianity. But if Christ has no free will, basically the idea of the Holy Ghost is not coming from Christ, it means that Christ doesn't really have a free will. And that should be a reason for Eastern Europe always being under different kind of dictators, because they don't like free will.
Well, I can. I'll take it back a little bit to Plato also, and one dialogue in particular that comes to mind, although there's a few where he talks about it. Socrates is talking with people, and one of the concepts that he asks about is, where do ideas come from? Like when you make a discovery, was it something outside of you that got sort of put into your mind, or was it always in your mind, and it's like you remembered it? And Socrates, so Plato wrote down the stories of Socrates. So Plato, Socrates said, no, it's like a process of remembering. The ideas are there already, and you have to bring them out in yourself. I think if you bring that forward, then into, because this is obviously before Christianity, before Judaism, right? Oops, excuse me. Let me not go too far afield. But bring that forward to the filioque, or the idea of human beings being made in the image of God. Now, I don't know, I wouldn't take that too literally, like in terms of, does God have a nose? I mean, forget that, I think. I think it's much deeper than this. It's, okay, what is it about God as creator? In what way are we made in that image? In what way are we creators? We're not God, we're not gods. But what is it that is an image of that that's within us? And I think this is why Platonic thought was seen as very compatible with Christianity, in the sense that in our minds is already a connection to the universe as a whole, a connection to creation as a whole, such that, because when you think about it, it's like a miracle that our ideas really have power out there in the world. Some thought that we have in our mind isn't just like some dog thinking about where to look for a bone, but it's a thought that lets us tap into creation and have power over it. It lets us then use that to do new things, to make things that are new, not that were never possible before, but would never have happened without our intervention. And we create new alloys, we create electrical motors, we create better ways of society and living with each other. So I think you have to look at the fact that our minds are in coherence with the universe, with creation as a whole, in a way that they work. That we can discover how it works and use that to improve what we're able to do in it and make life better for each other.
So do you believe the concept of Aristotle is that human beings has no free will?
No, I think we definitely have free will.
But I thought the concept of Aristotle, not
Yeah.
your opinion.
Oh, Aristotle?
Yeah.
I don't think free will was that compatible with his outlook. I don't know as much about Aristotle as I do about Plato, but I know that they definitely see things very differently. Look, today, free will is a big problem for people, because people think, okay, we'll figure it all out. All of physics, everything's about, if you get down to the very small, two particles interact with each other, and a magnetic field pushes on something. And if we just learn all about that, everything bigger is built up of these small principles. I don't think that's true. For example, in life, there are aspects of living organisms that we've not been able to explain from physics. Will we one day? I don't know. Have we so far? No. Are there a lot of problems? Yes. So people it's like faith, that eventually it'll all come down to physics. And then the human mind. Are we only biological? Most people today would say, sure, the brain, it's like the brain of a donkey or something. It's, it controls nerves and all of this. And, when people use drugs, clearly, it can have, having alcohol, these things that change the way you think a little bit. Clearly, there's a connection between the mind and the body. But does that mean that all of our thoughts just come from chemicals moving around? I think people who say that just have a faith that there's nothing else there. But I think experience shows the opposite. That, for example, being something creative is something that a computer can't do. You know, a computer is made up of little pieces. The way a computer process works is made up of pieces. But being able to come up with an idea that can't be expressed by them, this was proved formally in the 1930s, that there's no way to come up with a system that even can explain all the truths of arithmetic. There'll always be more to discover. That means you have to bring in fundamentally new ideas. Of course, it's true for physics and everything else. So I think that because the nature of a creative discovery is making a new concept that wasn't made from what existed before, or like a great work of music or poetry, it's something that's more than what the words had ever been used to say before. It's more than whatever had been meant before. It's clear the mind does things that couldn't be predicted, you might say. And so I think that free will is something we all experience every day. Is the other thing. We all know we all feel that we have free will, of course. In the past, sometimes you can say, well, I know why that person made that decision. It's because this is their personality. But at every moment, it's a choice. At the present, every moment is our choice of what to do. So, yeah, I think free will is real, and it's one of the major failings of a lot of science right now, that people have an outlook of the universe that excludes us. It can't be a universal truth if it doesn't include people, I think. So I don't know. I don't know how we might discover more about that, but I think that there's something about the mind that makes the functioning of our nervous system not purely biologically determined. So, I don't know what, but...
Well, definitely your being here is proof that there is free will. And what you have been doing with the report and what you're doing with your work and what we are doing with the Schiller Institute is also a proof that there is free will. This is not something that was predetermined or was in the genes or was in something we inherited from our parents, at least not me. It's free will, it's an intention. And the good thing is that these very powerful ideas, and there's so much you can dig into, if you take on the challenge and if you educate your mind and your emotions and you decide to go into this battle on behalf of mankind, there's a lot to do. But time has also proven that even if you have extremely limited resources like we have as an organization, I mean, basically, when we're talking about the infinitesimal, the resources we have in comparisons with the global financial system, we are talking about the infinitesimal here, you know, the smallest of the smallest. But there's an intention. And this intention can change the world. That's what we have seen as a process over the last 50 years. So I will just suggest to everybody to take on the challenge to walk in the footsteps of Jason.
Oh my God.
And to begin with, you don't have to walk in the footsteps of Jason. You can even walk alongside with him out of this room and continue the discussion with him and get good ideas of what to do. Because there's a lot of things that has to be done, but imagine where we are right now. I mean, the possibilities of this world. And that we are at a point where we not only can get unthinkable things to happen, if we carry this through, we're going to have the biggest renaissance humanity has ever seen. Because suddenly we're going to have not a little city-state somewhere doing something right. We're going to have a project where all of mankind can actually interact. 7 billion people at the same time. Almost at instantaneous speed, because you can communicate so much faster. So there is really no limits to what can be done. So we hope in a very short time we'll have Jason back here, and we'll have a lot more people at that time, and we'll continue this. and a lot more questions. And we'll continue the discussion at that time. So thank you for coming, and we hope to see you back soon.
Thanks.
And normally you're supposed to then have a bottle of scotch or something, but I don't see any.
Well, we can go pick some up.